Hello, Tim Wilmot here, and welcome to my watercolor demonstration. This time I'm going to cover my 5 tips for loose painting, how to paint in a loose style. What do we mean by a loose painting? Well, it's an impression of your subject. It's a suggestion. You're suggesting the form of an object or a shape. And it's implication rather than painting in a detailed way. It's totally the opposite to painting in a tight style. So totally the opposite of, if you like, a photorealistic or realistic style of painting. It's also going to be an economy of brush strokes, doing things in less strokes. Painting loosely may not come naturally to you, particularly if you're a beginner, if you're just starting out in watercolor. You may not naturally paint in this way. For me, my own personal experience has taken me many years to develop my style. If you look at my stuff from years ago, it was more of a tight style, the opposite to painting loose. And I've kind of over the years honed my style and adopted more of this loose approach. But I'm often asked in previous videos, how do you paint in this loose style? How do you paint in the way that you do? So here I'll be sharing my own personal 5 tips. Now this video is free to watch, not free to produce. If you like these videos, please make a pledge at my Patreon website. Patreon, the address is patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. For a small pledge, a very small amount, I'll be able to bring you high quality, full length watercolor tutorials, and you can try it yourself. You can send me your paintings for a critique. As I say, more details, please go to www.patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. So this is the scene for my watercolor demonstration. This is the harbour, the port in the island of Capri. A photograph of mine that I took many years ago. But it's a nice subject from a watercolor point of view. It's got plenty of interest. It's got background, it's got things going on in the middle ground, it's got something happening in the foreground as well. We've got lots of tonal values, differences in the darkness and the lightness of different areas of the painting. So we've got the very dark background building. I think this is the ferry building, or might be the customs building or something like that. Boats, we can see some of the large craft there. Boats enter the harbour, they dock over here, and there's loads of people walking backwards and forwards onto the island of Capri itself, which is over to the left. So quite dark in there, nice little shard of light hitting the side of the ferry building there. Lovely horizontal bits of light hitting these boats, and we want to think of shapes here. Yes, they're all individual boats, but in the distance certainly they're almost merging as one object, as one shape. So that's what we need to think of. So we've got the lovely light lines, a few figures as well. I always try to include a few figures in my landscapes. Adds a bit more detail to the picture. Helps with the scale, adds a bit more interest to it as well. So a few figures there. And then coming to the foreground, another bit of dark value, a few more dark values here. So as I often do in my paintings, I think of the painting being of different bands of values. So starting with the sky above, very light value, then maybe we're hitting something dark, then there's something light, then there's something dark, then there's something light, then there's something dark, and you get the idea. So bands, I think, lends itself quite well to a watercolor painting. Okay, so that's my subject. Let's see how we do on loose painting styles. Now the paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford. This is cold press, 300 grams in weight, or 140 pounds, and the paper size is 15 inches across by 11 inches down, and it's taped either side, on all the sides, with some masking tape. So to start off with the initial sketch, I'm using a 3B pencil to make this initial sketch, and what I'm looking at here, and you've got the reference photo top right corner there, what I'm looking at here, just trying to identify the main shapes, just get in the main shapes, try to illustrate them in a very brief style, starting there with the top left corner, working across the background, the top of the building, trying to also think about where the light areas are going to be, the dark areas, as I'm briefly describing the scene. Now for the middle ground and these boats, there's a lot of boats, so we have to think about which ones to include, which ones to exclude, and just getting in again the main outlines of those craft coming down towards us. And boats are a little bit easier to draw sideways on like this rather than at a funny angle. So a lot easier if you're a beginner, or if you're finding painting boats difficult. This is a lot easier. So let's include a figure. Starting off with the head, the body, and the legs. So here we're now into the foreground, starting from the left hand side where the this little ticket office is, or maybe it's the harbour master's building. I'm not quite sure. But just getting that foreground, and then the background, just trying to define the edge of the harbour, the water line there as well, maybe just a few trees in the background. And that is it for the drawing, and that's really, I think, the first thing I would say about painting in loose style is when you do your first sketch, and a sketch I think is quite important to get right when doing a watercolor painting, try and make it very brief. Don't spend a lot of time doing that initial sketch. Just get in those main shapes. So on with the painting, and after the initial drawing we'll be laying down our first wash. Now if I could just explain my palette here on the right hand side. So starting from the top, I've got neutral tint, burnt umber, coming down burnt sienna, yellow ochre, viridian green, cobalt green, cerulean blue, ultramarine blue, then alizarin crimson, which you saw me mix first. I laid in there across the horizon a weak wash of alizarin crimson, a sort of nice rosy pinkish colour, and now laying on top a bit of a mixture of cobalt blue and cerulean blue. I often mix those two together for the sky, cerulean blue is quite opaque, and it doesn't travel so fast down the page, so I can control it a little bit more. And then dabbing in a little bit of cobalt blue gives a nice shade of sky. So the aim here is to cover up the paper with this underlying wash, whereas with the sky and the beach and the sea, this will be the end colour, so I won't be going over those areas again. Make it a little bit darker on the left hand side. Now that dark red patch, that's going to be the roof. Things will dry a little bit lighter than we first see them, so you've got to, with a bit of practice, you've got to compensate for that and just plan for that. So sea, or the harbour. The brush I'm using is a Raphael brush, mop brush. Another question I'm often asked, what brushes do you use? I tend to prefer the Raphael brushes and the Escoda brushes. They're very good makes from France and Spain respectively. And then just mop up a little bit of some of these beads that we see, just to mop up the excess moisture. I picked up a bit of light red. Well, I forgot to mention the other colours in the palette. Alizarin Crimson. Below Alizarin Crimson is a bright red, which I'm using at the moment, a Winsor red from Winsor & Newton. And then there's a light red, so a dark terracotta red. Really good for Mediterranean rooftops. Then there is a cadmium orange, and then cad yellow. So that's the first wash done, and generally now we don't muck about with it. We let it dry 100%, make sure it's perfectly dry. Of course, you can speed up the process with a hairdryer. So a little bit of fast forwarding. Everything is dried up. You can see it's gone a good bit, a shade or two lighter. And we're now ready for some more detail work. So when I say detail work, we're still trying to keep things really simple. I mean, I think that's my second tip for loose painting, is to simplify the scene, eliminate details, just concentrate on shapes and forms, as I was describing in the introduction, just thinking about the main shapes of the buildings and the boats and the figures and the shadows, the shapes that they create. Just think about, simplify the scene, take things away. So it doesn't matter whether your subject is really complicated, lots of things going on, or very, very simple, just a few objects in there. Keep things simple. Now, I'm starting with the background and some background trees there. Just really in the background. It could have been a dark green. I've gone for a bluish shade of green. I'm using an old mop brush here that has seen better days, just to make those sort of foliage shapes there. And now we're going with the background ferry buildings. So mixing up a sort of classic, a classic sort of darkish grey here, bluish grey, of ultramarine blue, a very tiny bit of alizarin crimson, and burnt sienna. Quite often I'll spend more time mixing than actual painting. So I'm trying to get a nice edge to this mop brush. This is a slightly smaller mop brush than I was using before. This is still a Raphael synthetic mop brush, and it gives the same performance as a squirrel, a really expensive squirrel brush, but it's really cheap, really good value for money. So ferry buildings, starting from the left hand side. Doesn't matter if we leave a few little gaps here and there, that adds to that loose style. Keeping on looking at my edge just to make sure I've got that nice sharp edge. Constantly adjusting things. This brush is a size 4 Raphael mop brush. Soft aqua is the model. Then there's a bit of a dome on this building in the middle. Slap on a bit of colour below that. So I'm going back, you'll see that I'm going back into areas that I've done already. And timing is really important here. You can't leave that wash dry too much when you want to go back into it again. Otherwise you might end up with some nasty watercolor marks, cauliflowers and so on, which can look a little bit ugly. So timing is of the essence. So we've got this nice lighter area which I was pointing out in my intro, which we'll capitalize on there. Just painting now to the right of that little light shard. Key mixing, blending the colours, alternate the colours, don't make them two all the one colour. We're adding in some variety in here, getting a little bit darker also towards the base of the building, which I noticed in my observation. So it's going to be a thicker mix, that colour, and a touch of, you saw me there go for the neutral tint at the top, just to darken up that colour, taking it straight out of the palette. So now for the boats. Here it's important I've got a very good edge to my brush. So if you haven't got a mop brush that can be squeezed to give you a very sharp edge, then you'd have to do it with a synthetic brush. And just at the base of the ferry building, I can leave just a few little bits of paper unpainted that can give us the impression of perhaps people in the background, different shapes on the harbour side, objects and so on. Still, that ferry building is still quite moist. I can confidently add a bit of colour back into it, a thicker mix. It can't be more watery than what the wash was. Otherwise, as I say, you might end up with some negative effects happening. So try and think about the consistency of your paint. What's the ratio of water to pigment? Right, the harbour wall. Just basically following the pencil line that I had there. Quite easy. Now for the boats. This is quite an important phase to get right. We want to, going back to what I said earlier, the economy of strokes, trying to do them in as fewer strokes as possible, and giving the impression of those horizontal areas of light, the tops of the boats catching the sunlight. Not thinking about individual boats, just thinking about the shapes. And I think a third tip, one of my other tips for loose painting, and this will be my third tip, is the way I'm holding the brush. Very rarely will I hold it down towards the where the hair's the brush. I'm holding it right at almost halfway up, or sometimes at the very end, the opposite end of where the hairs are, so the very tip of the brush, which just makes you a little bit more relaxed, perhaps. Certainly I would be holding it. I'd be holding it like a pencil if I was doing some really detailed work, maybe towards the latter stage of the painting. But at this stage, I'm aiming for a relaxed style and holding the brush halfway up or at the tip. And very often brushes, they have a balance to them. I find with these Raphael brushes, they're not too long. They have a nice balance to them, quite slender towards the tip. Very easy to hold, and just helps you with that kind of style and where you're holding the brush. So with the boats, we went in with a light wash, made them a little bit darker towards the bottom, and now going in with the shadows, so it's thicker paint, a dark mix. I'm letting it bleed, it's going up against gravity into the boats, and have the shadows. Think about where the light's coming from. The light is coming from the top left, so I'm going to have shadows going out to the right, and we'll just let that do its thing now, with these colours now mingling, a nice bit of granulation appearing as well, which is quite an attractive thing that happens with watercolours, the granulation of colours. Some pigments granulate more than others, where they have that lovely texture on watercolour paper. So building this small little hut on the beach, just indicating some of the lines of the ridge tiles at the top there. We've got quite a large area of this building, so I'm going to have to, as I did with the background ferry building, I'm having to add in lots of different colours and hues just to make it a bit more interesting, not too dull. A little bit darker as we come down to, well, a good bit darker as we come down to the bottom, and those very dark foreground shadows. Another thing I'm doing is that I'm thinking about connecting different shapes as well. So the shadow coming out from the building is now going to be joining the shadows of those little boats on the beach. Rather than having them isolated and out on their own, we're trying to connect these different shapes together, trying to make the painting as a whole rather than lots of little individual elements. So I'm just suggesting maybe some foreground boats here, and very gently in one stroke paint in that hull. Continue up on the left hand side, bottom left corner. Now edges of the painting, they have to be quite brief. I can't be too detailed there. The focal point is going to be, well, perhaps it's the figure that we haven't done yet. Perhaps it's our eye is leading up to that light slither, that sunlight hitting the ferry building. So I don't tend to put in too much detail in the corners and the left hand side, the right hand side, the background, the foreground. Left very brief. Okay, figure, as I normally do, start off with the face. Now this figure is standing up, and that's what I'm doing right now. I'm standing up as I'm doing the painting. I see a lot of people, particularly beginners, they'll sit down doing their painting. They prefer to sit. And it's just my own personal preference. I used to sit, but I found that when I started standing, my paintings did get a lot looser. So try that. If you are traditionally a sitter, then try and be a stander. Try and stand up. It just helps you maintain that distance from the painting, so you're not too close to the detail. You're not being bogged down with any details. You're a sort of optimum distance from the painting, and you can very easily step back, go in a little bit closer. And it's sort of complementary to holding the brush at the very end as well, maintaining that optimum distance. So try standing up. Takes a bit of practice if you're not used to it. Now I've let that dry again, and as you can see, we've gone a little bit lighter. Next step is more detail work. So smaller brush. This time I'm using a small round synthetic brush with some dark paint. I've got a nice edge, nice point to my brush, and we're just getting a few verticals. I think we've always got to have horizontals and verticals in a painting, and those verticals sometimes are quite useful to, as I was saying before, joining up different areas of the picture, or the bands as I was describing earlier as well. So we're just going to get in a few architectural details of the building behind, the windows. rooftops. Just check my edge there. So not drawing every window. Going back to my second tip, simplifying the scene. Don't add in every single window as a rectangle or a square. We're just suggesting those windows. Just a few details on the left-hand hut, not too many. Just using that darker, almost pure neutral tint. Sometimes I do mix in the neutral tint with a little bit of, say, ultramarine blue or alizarin crimson. So I picked up a red there for some details on the boats. Careful not to chop that guy's head off. Just a line, a few lines along the hulls of the boats. Maybe a few ropes as well, supports to the craft. And you can see I actually drew a few little lines below little areas of the paper I hadn't painted on, so just capitalizing on that. Do a few more horizontal lines, almost dry brush strokes. There. Let's have a blue one. So I don't want to try and do this line all in one go. Nice and slow. There we go. We'll just pick up on a few of the figures on the far side. Just an impression of those figures, just indicating those figures. And I'm now just going around my painting, just looking for extra little things to add in. But I'm trying to be conscious of not trying to overdo it, trying to maintain that fresh feel. You can overpaint a watercolor to maintain that fresh, loose style. It's knowing when to stop. Use my figure to smudge things out while it's still wet. a few little horizontal lines and archways on the far building. So I think we're nearly done now. Smudge it out if it's a little bit too dark, or you want to soften up the edge. If it was too hard an edge, soften it up by just smudging it with your fingertip. Just dab in a few reds here and there. So that's it. We're done. Loose painting. So here is the end painting. The colours are a little bit truer to what they are in the original painting. I'm using a different camera for the video and the actual end painting here, but this is truer to the actual original painting. So this video is all about how to paint in loose style, sharing with you my 5 tips for painting in loose styles. The first tip was a short sketch, doing your outline drawing very quickly, not getting bogged down in any detailed work. Second tip, simplifying the scene. Think about shapes and forms. We're giving an impression of the scene. We're not going for that realistic style. We're simplifying, we're eliminating details, eliminating complicated things. As I say, thinking about the shapes and the form. Third tip for loose painting is how I hold the brush. I hold the brush at the very end generally, or halfway down, not holding it like a pencil. It prevents me from doing very detailed work. Fourth tip, standing up. Don't sit down, try and stand up. By all means, if you get tired, then sit down, but try and maintain that distance from the surface of the paper. Don't be too close to the action. Maintain that distance. And my fifth tip is the overall timing of the painting. So I've done this in maybe 35 minutes if I exclude the drying time. Using to speed up the process, I used a hairdryer, but I'm setting myself a sort of time limit. Sometimes with the other projects I've got on the go, I don't have too much time to spend on painting, so I have these time limits, and that might be another good thing to have a go at, is set yourself a limit of maybe half an hour. That might be difficult, extend it to an hour. 2 hours, maybe 2 hours maximum, I would say. So timing, setting a time limit, trying to accelerate your work, trying to speed up a bit. And it's sort of complementary to simplification, try not to get bogged down in any of those details. So that's my 5 tips for loose painting. If you want to see more of my work, you can see a gallery and paintings for sale up on my website, timwilmot.com, timwilmot.com. Please, let's have a dialogue going about loose painting. What do you struggle with loose painting? What are your tips for loose painting? So please, in the comments below, put in your comments. Let's get a dialogue going. If you like this painting, please click on the like button. Have a look back through my other videos as well on different topics around watercolor painting. But thanks for watching, and I'll catch up with you next time. Bye-bye.